interesting thing about these philosophical approaches is that his repentance would be purely internal. It would purely be for his own spiritual self. It wouldn't necessarily affect anything outside it because the damage is done. Xenia is broken, maybe for all time. I mean, that's the interesting thing. I think, that is the thing about hubris. That is the thing about, it's tragic because it's irreversible, essentially.
Please welcome Chrstopher Nolan.
Chrstopher Nolan is on top of the world. That's how it seems, anyway. Over the course of the last 2 decades, he's built quite the impressive filmography as a big-budget director, and is no doubt the biggest name in the industry currently, with what seems to be practically every A-list star falling over themselves to participate in whatever his latest project is. In fact, more and more you hear his name in the conversation for the greatest director of all time. Which is why it's interesting that, is it just me or does nobody seem to like this guy? Of course, not literally. He has more than a small amount of diehard fans, but for someone who looms so largely over the industry, he's oddly divisive, with him and his films often generating no small amount of controversy, perhaps most vocally from the political right, which we will go into, but also from the political left. At times, it feels like he is simultaneously beloved and kind of hated. Well, I've been kind of on a Nolan kick, you could say, lately, watching his biggest hits into the release of the Odyssey. And I think I have pieced together what is so particular about Chrstopher Nolan as an artist and the cultural implications of his divisive rise to the top of film, and what it says about the industry as a whole. In short, Chrstopher Nolan is the perfect capitalist artist. But before we get into that, I want to just give my personal opinion on Nolan as a director, just so you know where I'm coming from. And well, I think he's pretty good. Definitely insanely talented, if not just a little overrated. His films vary from pretty fantastic to not so great. Interstellar is fantastic, all the way up until the very end. Inception is worth watching, if nothing else, for the end, and Tenet is not worth watching at all. I mean, it felt like he saw the complaints about the nonsensical, blatantly paradoxical time travel ending of Interstellar and said, hey, I'll just make an entire movie about that. I really don't like Tenet. But yes, he is undeniably a very competent director and pretty fantastic at assembling an all-star team to put on his films. I mean, if we want to talk about GOATs, Ludwig Göransson is probably the greatest film score composer of all time. As for his latest film, The Odyssey, I actually really liked it. I have problems with the film, and I very much understand a lot of the criticisms some people have of it. Some people is the key word there, but it really did engage me the whole time, and it was just really good filmmaking. I also didn't mind a lot of the changes made in this adaptation of the story of the Odyssey, and in fact, I actually found a lot of value in some of them. Nolan is undeniably a very talented artist, but with all art and artists, as interested as I am with the actual artistry, I am equally interested in the politics behind it. All art is political after all, and Nolan is far from an exception to this rule. So what are Chrstopher Nolan's politics? I've seen people try to pin Nolan down in a few places on the political spectrum, from a liberal to a moderate to even a right-winger, but I think Nolan can be most accurately described, or at least as far as his work is concerned, as a small c conservative. Now, what does that mean? To quote Andrew Defty for the University of Lincoln in England, conservatism, the noun, or big C conservatism, refers to the Conservative Party, or a member of the Conservative Party. Small c conservatism refers to an opposition or resistance to change, a preference for things the way they are, or to put it another way, a tendency towards conserving things. Basically, little c conservatism is more of an intuition, one that leans towards traditional and, well, conservative values. A little c conservative does not need to be a supporter of the ostensibly conservative party or movement. Nolan, according to Open Secret, made a $2,500 donation to the Obama campaign in 2012. His films most certainly, however, exude traditionalist values and themes. Often they are very patriarchal. Nolan is infamous for being just completely unable to write compelling female characters whose motivations do not entirely revolve around the men of the story. The Odyssey was no different in this regard, though I will say Anne Hathaway absolutely gave an Oscar-worthy performance. Beyond this, his films can venture into the realms of armed forces and Secret Service deification. Tenet, I'm looking at you, and American exceptionalism, which can lead to some pretty significant blind spots in the messaging and depictions in his films. Perhaps most glaringly was in his 2023 movie Oppenheimer, a biopic about, well, Oppenheimer, the chief American physicist of the Manhattan Project, which was responsible for the development of the atomic bomb. Despite this being a very well-made film, I think it falls quite flat in its attempt to paint Oppenheimer as a morally gray, though still misunderstood American hero who was the victim of undeserved betrayal as well as his own overwhelming guilt. Furthermore, the film got into some hot water with Native American communities, most especially the Navajo Nation, which historically had their lands taken and used as a testing site for the Manhattan Project. Navajo workers also made up the majority of those employed to mine the necessary uranium and were not given any protection from the radioactivity. None of this was even mentioned in the film. By the way, a dam malfunction in 1979 led to the spillage of over 1,000 tons of solid radioactive material and 360 million liters of wastewater into the Puerco River. Over 30 years later, in 2012, the water in the Navajo reservation was found to have an average of 90 micrograms of uranium per liter, with some streams measuring up to 700 micrograms. The EPA defines above 30 micrograms per liter as harmful. Nolan's traditionalist theming is exactly why it's so interesting he's become sort of a pariah to the modern right, when just 20 years ago I feel like his films would have been hailed as peak American art by them. In fact, he kind of was. His depiction of the Joker is the darling of the far right, and despite being a great character, I will agree, I think it's wreaked more havoc on the culture of the internet than any other character in all of history. It just goes to show how much the modern American right has drifted into outright fascistic territory, that Nolan's small c conservatism perhaps has a much smaller political and cultural home than it once would have. Though lack of historical representation is far from the only controversy the old CN's films have been subjected to. Most recently, it's been revealed that during the production of The Odyssey, plastic prop skeletons were dumped into the environmentally protected waters in direct violation of the contract signed with the Italian government to allow filming on the island of Sicily. Film is dying. This is a pretty unavoidable fact. Movie theaters are still struggling even to this day to return to pre-pandemic levels of profitability and are dwindling in number. And going to the movies is an increasingly unaffordable activity for a large portion of the population. Not to mention, streaming companies are consolidating the market. As a result of all this, examples of the blockbuster film have become increasingly rare, with very few creatives and studios being capable of footing the financial risk and commanding the audiences to make one. But if there's one person that still can, it's Chrstopher Nolan. And it's because he can play the game. He knows how to appeal to large audiences. That little C conservatism we were speaking about earlier allows him to lean on established cultural norms without pushing them, without offending, and he makes major use of spectacle, sometimes at the loss of substance. Art under capitalism is a very particular thing. To quote Marxist academic John Molyneux, the question, what is art, then becomes, what is the peculiar social character of the labor that produces what we call art? The answer to this question is that art is the product of non-alienated labor. What I mean is labor that remains under the control and direction of the producer. Art can be considered in its most pure form when it is made solely for the sake of the art itself and the artist, under the artist's complete discretion. This becomes a natural conflict and crisis under capitalism, as most art, especially professional art, has to be made with profit in mind. If the artist wants to survive off of their work, they need it to sell, and if they want someone to distribute it to large audiences, they need it to sell well. This inherently discourages experimentation and creativity in favor of safety and marketability. Nolan has been able to maintain a more significant level of creative control and artistic vision in his projects because they naturally align with the corporate goal of mass profit. Now, I'm not claiming that they are low-quality pieces of work. Far from it. These aren't slop. In fact, these films are probably some of the best-made movies ever created. But I don't think any of Nolan's films have really done much to push the envelope outside of the technical realm, with Nolan having all the millions he could ever want to throw at them until they shine. And this doesn't mean that they are bad, and some of them are actually quite great. They are just made as much for the artistry as they are to bring in the cash, as all capitalist art is. And not to say that they're soulless either. Nolan very clearly cares a lot about movies. He grew up during the golden age of modern American capitalist film, the 70s to 90s, and then he perfected it. But I think this is why there's a natural level of backlash or aversion in some people towards Nolan and his films. On paper, with the backdrop of the dying film industry, it should be a great thing that someone is still capable of producing a true blockbuster, and in many ways, it is. But instead of feeling like Nolan's films are revitalizing or challenging the industry, it sort of just feels like they play into and prop up the same system and culture that brought it to the place that it is today. And with the top and bottom fourths of the entire Odyssey movie being locked behind an IMAX paywall, maybe even making it a little worse. At the end of the day, who is making the most money from the Odyssey's success but one of the very companies who are currently gutting the theater industry? Art is very important to me, as I'm sure it is to you, and it's hard to not feel completely hopeless about the place that it is today. But if I may just offer you a piece of hope, it seems the artistic world is increasingly dominated by corporate forces who care for nothing more than profitability, and human creativity is being smothered by greed. But very recently, I went to a local community theater production in my area, and I'm not gonna lie, it was pretty bad, and yet I'd be lying if I said it didn't make me feel a little inspired. I mean, on that stage were a bunch of normal, everyday people of different ages and walks of life, taking time out of their lives to get together and create something. It wasn't for money, they weren't getting paid, or fame. I don't think any of them thought they were gonna break out from this production of Tarzan, but just for the love of the game. Human creativity and community has existed long before the systems that seek to smother and extinguish them. And I truly believe, in my heart of hearts, that they will outlive them as well. So go make something. You're human, after all. This is James D. Thank you for watching.